Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. I'll be your moderator today. Let me just inform you that we are allowing people to join the call, so just a few more minutes, and then we'll get started. Okay, so just please be patient for just 2-3 minutes more. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, I think we can get started. We'll probably continue to let people into the session as we start, but we know we are all sort of pressed with time because at 9 o'clock we have the official opening, and this is therefore probably one of the first, let's say, in this time bracket, the first official events of this year's HLPF. So let me give you a work welcome on behalf of the entire set of organizers for this session to this virtual side event on a look into integrated national financing frameworks, ensuring ownership and alignment with national development priorities. This event is co-organized by an array of partners, in first and foremost, Reality of Aid Africa Network, which is actually the lead proponent, but in collaboration with the CSO Partnership of Development Effectiveness, as well as the CSO Financing for Development Group, the UNDESA Financing for Sustainable Development Office, UNDP, as well as the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. So welcome you all to this session today. let me start with some logistics, as I will be your moderator. I'm Stefano Prato from the Society for International Development, but really here in my capacity in the facilitation of the Civil Society Financing for Development Group. So first of all, please, if you haven't done it so, rename yourself by clicking on your name and put your name and organization. So that makes it easier for us to identify you in the context of the discussion. Secondly, be aware that we have interpretation available. In order to access interpretation, I know this is strange, I'm saying it in English, but it will be also in the chat box in French and Spanish. Please click on the interpretation button in the grid below and select the language of choice, and then ensure that you click on mute the original audio. There will be some presentation, but you can also click by clicking on view options. You will be able to click on the desired language of the presentation. Okay, this means that as much as the presentation may be delivered in one language, but it's available also in all 3 languages, slides included. We also kindly ask you to remain muted during the session and raise your hand in case you'd like to take the floor into the debate. And with this, again, let me welcome you once again to this session. We will have 2 segments. We start all together with a couple of initial presentations, which are really somehow setting the stage as a general overview on what is happening on integrated national financing frameworks by both our colleagues at UNDESA and UNDP. And this will be followed by a presentation of the CSO review of guidance materials, as we have produced a couple of key briefings on the process, and our researchers will lead this. And this will set the stage somehow in terms of information and angles and perspectives for a debate in which we will welcome 2-3 interventions, which I will introduce as we go along. And hopefully everyone will be short and sharp, and we'll have sufficient time to pick up on some questions and comments at the end of the first part, as well at the end of the second part. So that will be somehow the flow of our discussion today. Before we jump into it, let me also say that one additional participant was scheduled to be with us, a distinguished representative of the mission of the government of Sierra Leone. Unfortunately, he has some flight disruptions and won't be able to attend today, so he was in deep regret and asked us to convey his regrets at the beginning of the sessions. So let us jump straight into the discussion here. As you know, there's been increasing focus on integrated national financing frameworks in the past years. And certainly this is overall, I think, welcome, as civil society, and in particular, both as CPDE and Civil Society Financing for Development Group, we always looked at this with interest. There's probably nothing that could be wrong in theory with the idea of having integrated national financing frameworks that help the development process and development planning of countries. At the same time, theory and practice are sometimes different, and we've therefore raised a number of criticities on how some concerns could arise to the extent that, for instance, these frameworks could divert attention of some of the fundamental systemic barriers to global economic justice that do require systemic policy decisions and institutional reforms at the global level. So there could be, in some respects, some tension in the way in which we tend to domesticate the financing agenda, while in fact the financing agenda in the current stage is really dependent on global policy and institutional reforms. Secondly, and this will be maybe a major focus of today's discussion, is explore how these financing frameworks with their partnerships mechanisms and role of different institutions might be eroding or might offer a risk of erosion of democratic local ownership of development priorities. And this is certainly the issue of ownership is something that we'll debate at greater length in today's session. And lastly, there's been also a concern on the potential tensions within the toolbox of integrated national financing frameworks and the extent to which this may be a way to particularly focus on particular policy reforms or particular policy instruments that already may be in tension with other fundamental goals, such as human rights, tackling inequalities, combating climate change. And therefore, in the actual toolbox that includes what is considered and what is not considered in integrated national financing frameworks, there could be additional risks. But overall, I think we look at this with interest, and that's the reason why this session is co-organized together with different actors on civil society, but also on the side of UNDESA and UNDP, and in this particular case, the government of Italy. So on this short introduction, without any further delay, let me allow our speakers to step into the actual discussion. So first and foremost, I'd like to give the floor to Sherry Spiegel, Chief Policy Analysis and Development Branch of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office of UNDESA. Sherry, over to you for your initial presentation.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Stefano, for your introduction, and thanks to the organizers for putting this all together. And I think we have a slide presentation that we put together along with UNDP. So if someone can put that on. I can start speaking, but hopefully somebody will put the presentation on. So I guess I'll start, but again, I don't know who is supposed to, we put it into the chat. So someone's supposed to post it. So I want to start by saying that the point of INFFs, Integrated National Financing Frameworks, they came out, they were first, the term was first put forward in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda with the idea of facilitating integrated and effective planning and financing process. So we saw in our early days of looking at this, that there were more and more national plans, sustainable development plans, and just national plans. And more of these, were already, this was after obviously the SDGs were put in place, we're beginning to bring in the SDGs into them. But very few of them were actually financed, or certainly a majority of them didn't provide specific costings or details about how they would be financed. So there was this need to think about bringing in financing into the planning process. In addition, there was a need to think more about how financing, the implications of financing in certain areas on each other. So for example, financing of environment and policies that deal with environment, what does that mean for economics and vice versa? How do economic policies impact social and environmental factors? So this idea that to begin with, plans weren't being financed, but they also weren't in line with the thinking behind the SDGs and the thinking behind the Addis Ababa Action Agenda of an integrated approach, really starting with the Monterey Consensus on the financing side. But the other place that INFFs came out of was really requests from member states. So governments, particularly governments in the South, asked us as a secretariat and brought up, even prior to the negotiations for the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, exactly what this all means on the country level. What policy frameworks, et cetera, should be put in place to help to implement this on the country level. So it was really a request and really came out of discussions prior to the negotiations on Addis and the SDGs from countries mostly in the South. We should be really clear that this is not about implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. It is about a very small piece of it. And I think we have always really articulated that the issues that are put forward of systemic issues, trade issues, these big global issues, this does not replace them, nor should it. And I think that's something that we all make big efforts for in the discussions and certainly in the FFD discussions, but it's something, of course, we can all need to continue to do. In the Monterey, actually, and then again in Addis, there's almost a deal. And the deal was that countries are responsible for their own development, and the international community is responsible for an enabling environment that's supportive of development, which are those big systemic issues, and as well as support for countries in need. And so in every place we think about, and if you see the Financing for Sustainable Development report, we always look at things from both angles. What does the international community need to do? And then what can countries do given the international world that they're in? So that's the first thing to just say this, and if you look at the most recent report we're doing, we're really thinking about what are the exogenous shocks and what does that mean for countries and country policies? And how can we as a global community address those? We see INFFs as potentially a powerful tool, but I want to say upfront that one shouldn't expect too much of them. They are not going to solve every development problems. There are development problems and problems of development cooperation that have been there forever, for as long as any of us can remember. And actually, INFFs in some ways can help some of those challenges. It doesn't create a lot of those challenges. The idea is to help address some of those challenges, but it can't solve everything. And sometimes in the discourse, there's too much of an expectation that this is going to be the silver bullet we all need. And I want to just warn that nobody within the UN system is thinking of it that way. This is a tool, it's challenging, it's tricky, but yet planning and incorporating financing into planning is so important that it's worth trying. So what are they and what are they not? And on the slide, we have a few of the points there. So they're certainly not a new process or a new tool that countries have to adopt. They're an approach, a framework to planning and raising resources, and that, as I said, bringing financing into the planning process. The point is that all countries already have financing policies in place. So in a sense, the idea behind this is to bring together all of the financing policies and to see if they're coherent, where they're not coherent, where there are gaps, where there are constraints, where there are bottlenecks, and how to reframe the financing policy framework, policy world to address that. So the second point, of course, which is that they're country-led and owned. That's the bottom point on the slide, but really important. The guidance material that we put together in UNDESA is for countries, but to give countries the lead in terms of linking the strategies to their own, or the financing, the INFFs, to their own development strategies. As I said, there are also challenges with this because the Secretariat, the international institutions are putting together something as a frame, but this has to become something that's country-led. I have to say that the more countries we speak to, it's a pity we don't have someone here today, but the more that we speak to countries, the more we see countries taking ownership and building and shaping these into frameworks that work within their own countries, their own systems and their own environment. And that, because I think at the beginning, one of our biggest fears was it wouldn't be country-led, and how do we work in a way to maintain that stays? And we are really happy to see the more countries we talk to, we feel a sense of country ownership, which is really important. They are considered a docking station. I think that's important for one of the points that Stefano just made. There are many tools out there already. We all know that. We all know the issues of development cooperation is that it has been incredibly fragmented. And this is one of the big challenges of development cooperation for the past 30, 40 years. The idea of the INFF is to try to some extent, bring them together and bring coherence. Now, that's, again, impossible, but we can try, and we can try to find ways to, at least starting with a subset, to try to bring them together, create some coherence across these tools. So it's not something where the INFF is creating this broad range of tools. The INFF and the new platform we have is an attempt to try to bring some of these tools together. And the other piece of this is that part of this is to think about peer learning, to learn from countries, what countries are actually doing, what experiments they're doing, and bring those to share the lessons from that back to the global guidance we work on, as well as to share it with other countries who are doing similar things. So this idea of moving beyond the tools that we have on our plates, bringing them together, creating coherence, but also learning more from experiences, from experiments, and trying to have a broader way of thinking of some of this. And finally, what's not on the slide is just to say that these are linked to the goals. So the INFF doesn't set the SDGs, it doesn't set human rights agreements and international agreements, and it doesn't set country priorities. The idea is to use this to incorporate, to strengthen those agreements and to strengthen those goals by trying to bring them into financial and economic thinking and vice versa. So it's not trying to set these goals, it's trying to say these are the ideas that are out there, priorities that have been set, again, by the countries, not by us, and that how do the countries then go ahead and improve planning to be able to implement those goals. So if we can go to the next slide, it's, as you all know, it's organized around four or five building blocks, and expands on what the INFF approach is all about. I'm not going to go through the specifics since I think we all know those, most people in the call, but they're on the slide. And the first point is to have the right people at the decision-making process table throughout the process. That means on the government side, having ministries of environment and labor, not just ministries of finance and central banks. It means having practitioners. That includes the private sector. I want to be really clear about something because it also means having civil societies and stakeholders. The private sector is not a stakeholder in the sense that it's not individuals being impacted by the policies put in place. The private sector, though, is an important player, and they're an important financer. And governments have made that really clear that one of the goals they're looking for is what policies they need to think about private sector participation. I'll say a little bit about that in a second, so I don't want to go into that too much right now. But the next point, of course, is civil society, local stakeholders really need to be involved, and that's the idea throughout the process, from identifying the needs, risks, and constraints to monitoring and implementation. But I just want to add one more thing, that of course the INFF can't change governments. It can't make, and that's not the goal. So it's the purpose of the process is to bring everyone together to talk, but it's not going to solve problems that exist in governance that are broader that this sort of framework can't solve. The second point is having the right type of information. And the third point is really knowing what questions to ask. And the different elements that are on the screen sort of look at some of those issues. The right type of information, a lot of that comes out of the inception phase. And the knowing what questions to ask part of that comes out of both the inception phase and the assessment and diagnostic. I meant the assessment and diagnostics, as well as the financing strategy. And one big part of that is the question of coherence. And so I want to say a little bit about coherence. There's coherence in many different ways. So the INFF aims to have stronger coherence against economic, social, and environmental across the goals. It aims to have greater coherence across policies that are in these different areas. And so one place to think about that, I just want to give one example, and I noticed this example was also in the paper that was circulated, is the example of the enabling environment. So in the traditional way of thinking about it, the recommendation has always been, well, you need to strengthen the enabling environment for private investment. And that's true. The point that's put forward in the material, in the guidance material, is that some of those regulations may hurt environmental and social aspects as well. And so every single issue, when you think about it, there's a part of the process is to understand what are the implications of making a change here for example, for greater private investment, what is the implication of that on the environment and the social side as well? And to bring those trade-offs into the thinking, in the economic thinking as well. And that's one of the value addeds of having this sort of process. On public and private roles, there's a big emphasis on the public side. So public budgeting is one of the main thinking in the INFF process. As I said before, private investment is important as well. I think that the point that is really stressed in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, actually, and in the INFF process, is bringing these together. And what does that mean? We know that there are, the idea is that there are different roles for public and private investment, that both are really important, but they don't do the same thing. They're not substitutes for each other. And so the INFF asks the question of what role is private investment in this country and this context, and how do we get it right? And so it's not about pushing this type of investment or this type of investment. It's about saying, what are the different types of sources that are out there? What is the best way to increase those sources? And what is the best way to use those sources and get them right and get the distribution correct? So that's some of the thinking that's underlying the analysis and the guidance material that's been shared. Now, of course, this is an enormous challenge. As I said before, INFFs are not going to change decades-long challenges for development finance, but they can be a step in doing so. And in bringing actors together, in thinking in a more coherent way, and in trying to address some of the challenges we have in the development finance world. We see a really important role of civil society in supporting this work and in making sure the implementation mirrors the ideas. We all know that implementation is always challenging. And so how do we, working together, get that right? I think that there's definitely a really big openness for constructive and honest feedback. The first iteration of our guidance material is available at INFF.org. We see that material as living documents that are updated as we learn from country experiences, from feedback, et cetera. So that this is a process of learning and growing and learning from peer learning from other examples. And we always think that there's room to continually to strengthen the methodologies and then see how those methodologies are implemented. We don't see methodology and implementation as separate. The methodology has to be implementable. And so we have to bring these together. Just to give a little update on our work, we're working on a number of deep dives now into details such as LDCs, SIDS, domestic areas, domestic resource mobilization, financial sector development, as well as sectors like health, education, et cetera. And the other thing we've been working on together with UNDP is the INFF facility, which, as I said, is to bring everything together, to bring the capacity development work together, to make it more coherent. And these strands are out there. The idea is to bring them together, to strengthen them by creating a framework and creating a way to strengthen coherence. And with that, I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Tom from UNDP.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for a very comprehensive, but also very balanced presentation. This is really helpful in setting a clear stage on the opportunities of integrated national financing frameworks, and at the same time clarifying what they are not and what they are not meant to be understood to be. Thank you so much. That was really very clear. Let me now invite Thomas Beloe, Chief of Program of the UNDP Sustainable Finance Hub, to complement Sherry's presentation. Thomas, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Stefano and Sherry, also for your great presentation. Could somebody put those slides back up? We'd merged our slides into this. There we go. Thank you so much. I won't be long. I want to first thank you for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our colleagues on some of the civil society perspectives on the integrated national financing frameworks. I should begin, perhaps where Sherry left off, which is to say a little bit about some of the country experiences that are emerging. And I emphasize the word emerging because the integrated national financing framework.
Sorry, Tom. Please let's make sure that we all muted other than those speaking, because otherwise there is echo. Thank you so much. Tom, over to you. Sorry for the interrupt.
That's okay. So I just wanted to emphasize the fact that integrated national financing frameworks are very much a work in progress. And at the core of the integrated national financing framework is an emphasis on broadening the constituencies that engage on finance policy. So, you know, we very much welcome at UNDP and across the UN, the engagement of civil society in the integrated national financing frameworks, and look forward to discussing how we can strengthen that. You'll see in this slide, there are 86 countries that are developing integrated national financing frameworks across the world. The vast majority have oversight mechanisms, governance and coordination arrangements that are chaired by ministries of finance, sometimes by planning or economy or the office of the prime minister. The point being that these are, again, country-led financing frameworks, and the vast majority are making use of institutional arrangements that are already in place, but emphasizing again the broadening of constituencies in the discussion around finance. And if we move to the next slide, you'll see here from a survey we've recently conducted to look at those 86 countries in a little bit more depth, that we still have a lot to do in terms of the engagement of civil society in nationally led integrated financing framework discussions. This figure here, this 28%, is of participation of civil society in the formal governance coordination structures for INFFs. There are also financing dialogues that take place as part of the process of developing an INFF. And we're seeing, you know, for example, in Nigeria, that whilst there is a high-level committee that supports the development of the INFF, chaired by the Minister of Finance, there are also a plethora of open discussions that are used to inform the development of the INFF. Likewise, in Ghana, where there is a whole infrastructure at the local level for engaging stakeholders in the development of the INFF. Likewise, in Indonesia, it's a pity we do not have a colleague from a country to talk us through this, but there the INFF, which is led by the Ministry of Planning, includes a great range of consultations to bring in the perspectives of civil society into the INFF. The emphasis again is this is a work in progress, and we can do more and should do more to engage different constituencies in the INFF process. If we move to the next slide, Shari had mentioned the fact that one of the gaps the INFF at the country level is trying to fill is the gap between planning and policy and finance. And here you'll see on the right here, of those 86 countries, there are some 60 that are developing financing strategies, you know, many of them, 39, for the first time. In other words, there had been no financing strategy for their medium-term development plan before, and now there is an effort to put one in place. In other countries, 25, the financing strategy is not new, but rather it is more comprehensive, and particularly trying to bring in private sector finance as a resource for national development plans. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see, I'm sorry you won't be able to read the text underneath, but really this is showing the diversity of finance reforms that are being articulated in an INFF. As I say, you won't be able to see it there, but 50 countries are taking forward budget reforms as part of their INFF, looking particularly at how sustainable development and the SDGs can be integrated into budgets and budget policy. In some countries, these budget reforms, like in Uzbekistan, are being linked to debt instruments such as SDG bonds. There is an SDG bond that was issued in Uzbekistan as part of the INFF. In other countries, it's linked to accelerating tax reforms, for example, in Gabon, looking at green taxation in particular. And yet more so are countries looking at private sector reforms. For example, in Mongolia, the INFF is linked to a new policy around disclosure for the stock exchange, which is in effect aligning some $2 billion of capitalization with sustainable development. So there are a great range of reforms that are being taken forward. And again, I think if I go to the last slide, let me just finish by emphasizing what Shari has also emphasized, which is that with the kind support of the Italian government, the Swedish government, and the European Union, we've put together a technical facility to support countries taking forward the INFF. And we really look forward to engaging with civil society more as we move forward to provide support to civil society at the country level to engage with the development of INFFs. So look forward to discussing with you how we can do that more and better moving forward. Great thanks, Stefano and colleagues, for this opportunity.
Thank you so much again, Shari and Tom, I think, for clearly laying the ground for what is happening in terms of the combined DESA UNDP initiatives. And again, sorry that some of the country representatives couldn't be with us in the end, but I'm sure we will hear a little bit in the second segment of the discussion. But before we do that, I'd like to ask us to complement this initial presentation with the review of the guidance material and basically the combination and compilation of critical concerns that civil society has been pulling together, thanks to our speaker here, Polly Meeks, who is a good friend, but also an independent researcher that has been working with us and with our constituencies closely to crystallize and put on paper the critical thinking that we have in the current phase. And it's a process that is evolving because as much as we already went through steps through, and Polly will soon explain that, we're also doing now an assessment at the level of country processes. Polly, over to you. Please walk us through.
Thanks very much indeed, Stefano. So yes, as Stefano said, what I'm going to be speaking about today is the findings, the emerging findings from a quite detailed review of the INFF guidance, together with review of materials produced by some of the partners who are supporting INFFs, and some review of some of the more contextual materials around the financing for development process and its recent outcomes. Obviously, that's a huge area, and I can only sort of scratch the surface in this presentation, but we've got a report that's forthcoming that will be published later in July, and there's also a report that's a shorter briefing that's already in the public domain, which you can find on the Civil Society Financing for Development Group website. So keep an eye out for that CPDE report that's going to be coming out in a few weeks' time. Just to clarify that the scope of what I've done so far has been looking at the guidance that's available sort of at the global level. And as Stefano mentioned, this will be supplemented by some desk-based country-level case studies that will be published later this year. And those will allow some more granular conclusions to be made, I hope. But even on the basis of the work that I've already done, there are some key issues that are emerging. I think there are some slides. Yes, that's great. The slides are showing. So move on to the next slide, please. Before I get into the detail, I just wanted to re-emphasize, and Stefano's mentioned this as well, but I'm definitely not coming at this from the point of view of complete opposition to the idea of INFFs. On the contrary, I think a lot of the underlying ideas around coherent and quality financing strategies and around making sure that international cooperation is aligned to the priorities of people in the global south, those are ideas that are very hard to argue with, and I think we get a lot of support from a lot of people in this meeting today on the civil society side. But the concerns that I've found through the work that I've been doing are more about how INFFs are currently being promoted and how they're currently being implemented. So I'll just pick on three of the key emerging issues in turn. If I could have the next slide, please. So the first issue, it's about the balance between the national and the global. And again, this picks up on something that Stefano's already mentioned. So by their nature, INFFs intrinsically focus on the national level. But of course, as everybody here is all too well aware, many of the barriers that countries in the global south face to financing their priorities are the result of systemic barriers that are outside their unique control. And of course, in principle, there wouldn't be a problem with having these two approaches being considered in a complementary way, INFFs looking at the national level, other processes looking at the global level, if those processes were both making rapid progress. But of course, that's really not what we're seeing at the moment. And even just looking at the outcomes from the most recent Financing for Development Forum, we see that long-standing proposals on reforms for the governance of international tax rules or for resolving debt crises in a systematic way, those kinds of proposals really have been stagnating for a very long time. So when you have a situation where those proposals are not making any progress, but at the same time lots of energy is going into the national level, you get a risk that this national level focus could distract attention from some of the fundamental global issues. And that's where there's more of a concern. So moving to the next slide, please. So the review that I've done is recommending, of course, obviously first that all the stakeholders involved in the INFF process do everything that they can to advance progress on these global governance issues. But also, and it was encouraging to hear UNDESA's presentation in this, that stakeholders do more of what UNDESA was doing in presenting INFFs, definitely not as a unique silver bullet, but locating them within the context of these wider structural challenges. Next slide, please. So then moving on to the next sort of broad group of concerns that I've identified through this review. These concerns relate more to democratic ownership of financing priorities by countries and peoples in the global south. And I looked at this in two dimensions. The first was looking at the relationship between global south governments and development partners. Now here it's really complex. And as several of the previous speakers have recognised, the INF process is designed and intended to be led by countries in the global south. But to try to put it in a nutshell, I'd be happy to come back to this in the discussion because there's quite a lot of detail. But in a nutshell, from what I've reviewed, I'm not convinced that there isn't still a risk of a tension and a power imbalance when you get into the detail of implementation, perhaps particularly around some of the implementation of the development finance assessment process, which often accompanies the INFF. There's this intrinsic tension, power imbalance between some of the resource-rich organisations that are involved in the process and the space that's potentially left for national governments. There's a lot more that could be said, but I'll leave it at that for now, just the flagging that there's this potential risk there. The second dimension that I looked at within the sort of democratic ownership question was the role of rights holders in ensuring that ownership is not just local, but is also really democratic and responds to the priorities of groups who are perhaps further from power. Here, I think there's stuff that it would be helpful for the guidance to emphasize more. It's true that there are a lot of positive references to the role of civil society, but I think what's missing is a really clear and consistent recognition of the distinctive role that rights holders have to play in the process, that they're not just one other stakeholder among many or one other group of experts among many, but that their participation is really fundamental to ensuring that this process is democratic and does speak to the priorities of the people who are on the sharp end of poverty and inequalities. So next slide, please. The guidance makes a couple of recommendations that just pick up on those two concerns around ownership. Then move on to the next slide. Then the third sort of group of concerns that came out of the review was around the range of sort of proposed policy options, tools, and approaches that are put forward in the guidance. And as several previous speakers have mentioned, the guidance isn't seeking to dictate one approach, but still I was concerned based on what I read that perhaps the range of options wasn't left as wide open or as completely balanced as perhaps we'd hope to see in a country in a process that's really putting hands into the countries and the peoples of putting power into the hands of the countries and peoples in the global south. It's absolutely true, as the speaker from UNDESA mentioned, that the process does include this sort of facility for considering trade-offs and considering risks. But I think to make that sort of consideration of trade-offs and risks work as well and be as aligned as possible to poverty reduction and inequality type priorities, I think there are a few things that could really be emphasised more in the guidance. The first of these is around making clearer the risks of some of the assumptions and approaches that are put forward. So to touch on a couple of examples, throughout the guidance, there's quite a strong emphasis on economic growth as a sort of assumed objective of most of the countries that are implementing INFFs. And I'd point out here that it's not the INFF process is not just for countries in the global south. In theory, this could also be countries in the global north, where there's an assumption that economic growth would still be an objective. And that assumption that isn't cross-referenced to the growing body of literature that's questioning how far economic growth really can just be taken as read as an assumption in the context of the very, very urgent threats to planetary boundaries. So it would be helpful if that kind of risk was acknowledged more. Similarly, touching on the sort of business enabling environment type question. Yes, it's true that there is this trade-off process, but to help people weigh up the risks of reforms to the business enabling environment, it would be really helpful if the guidance made more reference to existing research on what some of the potential risks associated with some sorts of business enabling environment reforms and tools have already been identified. So again, it would be helpful just to flag more clearly throughout the guidance some of the potential risks, some of the existing research on risks associated with some of the tools that are mentioned. At the same time,
Polly, sorry, don't want to interrupt you, but remember there is translation. So you may want to slow down a little bit because otherwise our colleagues will be struggling. But then I also use this opportunity to then ask you to wrap it up so that we can sort of open maybe for a few comments, and let me therefore start warming up the audience for maybe 1, 2, 3 interventions. But sorry for the interruption, and back to you, Polly, after the translators have taken a little bit of a breath.
Thank you, Stefano. So yeah, okay, I'll try and wrap it up just in a couple of very brief points. So in a nutshell, to try to make the trade-off risk assessment type process in the INFFs as bulletproof as possible, I'd recommend 3 things really, and I can move on to the next slide for this. First, recognise really clearly where there is existing research on the risks associated with some of the tools and approaches that are being proposed. Second, make clearer the binding obligations that governments have under the international treaties that they've subscribed to. So on the environment, on human rights, among others, make clear that those obligations, they're not just things that can be traded off against other objectives, they're absolutely binding. And third, bringing into focus a wider range of alternatives, make the range of policy options as pluralistic as possible. So going beyond tools that have been developed by international financial institutions and multilateral bodies, looking at the widest possible range of tools and approaches coming out of the UN human rights architecture, out of civil society, out of different countries in the South that have trialed different approaches over the past decades. So yeah, I'll wrap up there, but look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Polly. That was very, very clear. So let me, before we hear from another set of panelists, 3 panelists, some reflections, particularly on the country processes and circumstances, let me see if there is anyone who would like to take the floor for a short comment on what they have heard so far. Please do raise your hand, or place your name in the chat box and I will call on you. I know that there's quite a lot to absorb because we've been we heard a lot of information, a lot of angles. Okay, maybe not now, but please do think about what you may want to contribute to the discussion with. So I'm gonna basically move on with our second segment, hoping that I'll get back to the audience at the end of this. So first of all, let's hear a little bit in the second part on different integrative approaches to this, both in terms of the G20 frameworks, but also in terms of national perspectives on INFF implementation. So before moving to the second latter aspect, let me invite Minister Marco Ricci, who was the chair of the G20 Development Working Group under the Italian presidency, but who has a very long-lasting experience on these kind of processes, to give us his insights on the G20 framework and the discussion that took place in the context of the Development Working Group. Is also a pleasure because there's a long time friendship with Marco, so I'm particularly happy to welcome him here. Marco, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Thank you, and thank you also for the nice words. You have actually, yes, we cooperated quite a lot some years ago, and now unfortunately we didn't have time to I mean, our paths didn't cross as often as they did in the past. As Stefano said, I'm taking the floor in my previous capacity of chair of the G20 DWG, Development Working Group, during the Italian presidency. And my intention is to give you some insight of what were the discussions in the group, but at the same time have a broader picture of what Italy did as presidency of the G20, also for the sake of policy coherence, and also trying to face these systemic challenges that are hampering developing countries. As you know, when we decide our priorities for the G20, we were in the midst of the worst crisis since World War II. And the pandemic had exacerbated the scissor effects of SDG financing gap, increasing financing need and decreasing availability of resources. This is why, well, Italy undertook a series of political decisions that tried to cope with the extent of the crisis that broke up in 2020. First of all, I would like to remind that we extended the debt suspension sustainability initiative. We suspended the debt of the low-income countries, and the 50 low-income countries profited from it. And as a following step, and this is the initiative we are now working on, we adopted a common framework, which is, as you know, a more ambitious instrument because it aims to engage all donors, including private donors, around cases of high debt countries for more structured intervention to make debt sustainable. We know that there are no easy recipes, but we believe that the only way forward is for all creditors to be involved, since the Paris Club now holds only a minority share of developing country debts. And at the same time, as also for the sake of coherence, we would like to remind that in the finance track of the G20, we promoted the adoption of a global minimum tax, which we see as a first step towards a global tax. Coming more specifically to the activities undertaken to face setback in the implementation of the Agenda 2030 in the context of the Development Working Group. As I said, we decided to prioritize the topic of financing for developments, and in particular, we decided to focus on support to the integrated national financing frameworks. For the first time ever, Italy, to raise the visibility of the development track in the context of U20, organized a development ministers meeting. It was held in Matera at the end of June, and in this occasion, ministers had the possibility to discuss and to support INFFs. This led to the adoption later on by the G20 Development Working Group of, I will read the title because it's the G20 Framework for Voluntary Support to a Greater Uptake and Operationalization of the Integrated National Financing Framework for SDG Finance and COVID-19 Recovery in Developing Countries. This framework was later endorsed by G20 leaders at the Rome summit last October. And we are continue to work in supporting INFF implementation, because as you know, we supported the INFF facility, which was launched last April with the support of other government, as Thomas Bieler from UNDP reminded us. And we are continuing reviewing progress on INFFs in the context of the DWG during the Indonesian presidency. And this is why, for a second year in a row, UNDP was tasked to prepare the INFF Sustainable Investment Stocktake, which will be discussed in the next meeting of the DWG, which take place in August. I would like to thank. It was very useful to listen to the concerns of civil society. I read the paper which introduced this meeting. I think it is very important to be very inclusive in the discussion over these instruments, which are designed in the interest of developing countries, but that of course have to live with the more challenging systemic problems that we are facing worldwide. Italy, let me say that Italy is, of course, a strong supporter of ownership and leadership in the support of INFF, and in conclusion, I would like to thank Reality of Aid Africa for organizing this side event, and would like to reaffirm that Italy is committed to engage for a great coherence of the financing for sustainable development, both at the local and at the global levels. And I will be glad to continue listening to the intervention of this session. Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you so much, Marco, and really a pleasure to reconnect with you on this event. Let me now continue with our two CSO speakers, so that then we can have some space for discussion. And of course, we also want to hear back from Sherry, Tom, maybe Polly, after they have also heard these various presentations. So let me start with Vitalis Meja, who is the director of Reality of Aid Africa, who is actually our host here today, together with the other co-organizers. But he's also the non-executive chair of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. So I think it will be interesting to hear from him, from his perspective, both on Kenya and beyond. And after him, let me introduce him now so that we go straight into that. Rodolfo Lahoy, who is the head of the Policy Communication and Training team at IBON International, will reflect more from on the Filipino experience. So Meja, over to you, and then Rodolfo will follow. Thank you so much.
I thank you very much, my friend, dear brother Stefano, for indeed moderating this session, and really also congratulate fellow co-organizer UNDESA, CPDE, the FFD group UNDP, and the government of Italy. I think this topic is very timely, especially now with the different global challenges we are faced with regard to financing and the emerging challenges that require finance in order to target the development challenges it were. I just want to take 5 to 6 minutes to put 3 issues on the floor for our consideration. One is that indeed the example of Kenya is that they are still developing an INFF, With regard to that process, I think the government indeed did initiate a steering group, a technical steering group to facilitate the process. And that included civil society, local authority, and foundations. I think in terms of looking at the products that have been developed around that framework, I think that has been very inclusive. I think, but beyond that, the question has been, the feeling that it is being led as a process we had with the old PRSPs, where you had the consultants being flown in from outside to come and look at the systems, and then produce a draft report, and then people react to it. And I feel that that really has a major bearing on the ownership question, but also on how we internalize and institutionalize the process within the country's system. So that would be my first observation, that the process needs to be a bit more owned, designed nationally, and be nationally driven. So that would be the first. The second point is, at the moment, it seems to be more like colleagues have stated, it's within the context of the ministries of finance. But if we are talking about sustainable development, we know it's not just about finance. As the initial, in the opening remarks, it was clearly stated that there is a need to have coherence around the issues, around the actors, but at the moment is largely laid from a financial perspective and is not moving beyond the ministries of finance. And that really also questions the issue of ownership at the government level, where only one ministry is consulted and engaged on these aspects, when there are other broader ministries that equally have implications for the achievement of SDGs. So we need to look at that. Now, then, so the fundamental question, and I think Stefan already raised this, is what is the political economy of this? And how do you make sure that, aside from the global reforms, financial reforms that are needed, that also the local political economy is taken care of? And therefore, because I think the system well recognizes that there are other systems for planning and for finance planning already in place. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is the added value for this process, especially at the national level in this juncture? Are we not adding transaction cost in terms of processes, and also in terms of tools that are out there? And which then makes us ask, is there really a demand for this, or this is supply driven? Because I see, especially I've engaged in both Kenya and Malawi process, and governments see this tool as a way of generating knowledge about the financial options are there, but they also want to know how much actually goes, especially to civil society. And so it is being seen as a way of being able to monitor or track what is happening to other stakeholders, rather than as a planning tool, which is becoming really an issue that we need to grapple with in terms of the politics of it. But the second point is really, what is the incentives for donors or development partners to engage? Because you will find governments, yes, maybe is too excited about it, and at the global level there is that much excitement, but at the national level there's really no level of interest or that much uptake that it is anticipated. And so we are asking what because we are selling it much to be about government planning, government framework, but we know at the national level, particularly from developing countries, development partners still play a very big role in terms of determining direction of development funding. And so what is the need for them in order to really engage in this process? That is not very clear to them. And so getting them on the table indeed is becoming another additional work for governments. The second last point is, what kind of behavior change do we need, or do we want, or do we expect out of this exercise, especially from development partners? It's not enough just to say that you have a tool to be able to track, to be able to see, but how does that tool lead into a behavior change that is necessary to generate sufficient resources to finance SDGs? I think that is still not very clear. The last point is this issue of democratic ownership. I think, like I've explained, it is really important that when you're talking about democratic ownership, all the stakeholders are on the table from the beginning. From the design, before even the inception report is produced, we need to be able to engage with the terms of reference. We need to be able to really agree on the key questions and areas that need to be looked at. But aside from that, really be able to ensure that we mobilize all stakeholders that we need to be tracking information about on the table. Otherwise, it really does not make sense to say that this is a government tool and nobody really uses it or is interested in populating it. I thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you, Brother Meja. Always very sharp and straight to the point. Very, very helpful. Rodolfo, I think you may want to therefore add additional elements to what also Meja has told us about the African experience from your own Asian and particular Filipino angle. Rodolfo, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano and Meja, for those very useful reflections. I have a slide, great, that's showing. So let me preface this by saying that my slides will cover reflections on available annual reports of a joint program on the INFF between the Philippine government and the United Nations. As I will share later on, and as initial reflections, given the state of implementation of the Philippine INFF, I believe much more could be done later in expanding this. Nevertheless, I think as early as now, there are already useful questions that we could ask, on which I will end later, and hopefully we'll add more to the crucial questions Meja already asked. So next slide, please. Just to offer a brief quick context, that in the bigger picture, as with many countries, the Philippines is and the Filipino people especially are braving the onslaught of the economic crisis, among other crises around the world today. And this comes at a time, or this comes with a history actually, of the Philippine government's reliance on foreign investment. And it's something that has been in the policy priority of the Philippine government for a long, long time. And I believe one of our concerns now is that in terms of the INFF guidance, the Philippines is actually cited as an example of how, which is contained in this quotation here, how a development finance assessment in 2017 included questions that compared the Philippines vis-a-vis other Asian countries in terms of FDI levels. So the question that was framed was already whether or not the Philippines was attracting FDI compared to other Asian countries, but not necessarily asking, and I think this is the more important question for us in the Philippines, whether FDI in itself, given the Philippines' history, actually contributes to the sustainable development of the people and their rights. I think it's a crucial question for us in civil society, whether the investments in special economic zones or or the tax incentives for transnational corporations to invest, are they really bringing about the technology or the development that is promised? And I think another discussions elsewhere point already to limitations on that front. So next slide, please. Just some quick facts about the Philippine INFF. It's focused on a human capital approach. It's focused on investing in services in such a way that it will contribute to economic growth in the long run. because investing now in the education of the youth, etc., will have a more healthy and stronger working population later on, and that will contribute to economic growth. That's the model that's being adopted by the Philippine INFF. So the focus areas in terms of SDGs will be about education, health, and gender, that focus on human capital. In terms of actors involved, it's led by the Economic Development Agency, authority of the government in partnership with the UN. And in terms of other domestic government actors involved, you have the finance and the budget departments. In terms of international actors, the World Bank supports this initiative. Private sector actors in the Philippines support this as well, especially coming from big business. And currently in the process so far, there are a handful of CSOs who have been engaging. And there are currently 2 structures, as far as I know. There is a technical working group, which is a multi-stakeholder working group that has the private sector, government, and CSOs, as well as a national steering committee that nevertheless is primarily led by the government and UN agencies. The national steering committee will be the one who sets the practical direction, really, of the INFF in the Philippines. So next slide. This is just to point out that actually, I think this is a bit, I think it was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers or 2 of the speakers that there's an even progress in INFFs around the world. In the Philippine case, it's very modest. There have been significant delays, but nevertheless, it was launched in September 2021. That kind of focused more on putting forward that framing of development as a population issue, as a investment in the youth issue, as well as hearing the expressions of support from the variety of stakeholders, including the World Bank, for instance. The sub bullets there, the 3 sub bullets are just some of the things that have moved in terms of the INFF in the Philippines. But as you see in the figure above, much more has to happen. So next slide, I will focus more on pointing out that as I began this presentation, I was already focusing on how the Philippine government has been focusing on attracting private capital historically since the 1970s, especially onwards. And we think as civil society that in terms of the framework of the INFF in the Philippines, that narrative we call the financing gap narrative is reproduced in this joint program on the INFF, in that despite the language about alternative and multiple sources on financing, in practice, this usually entails a reliance on private capital given their existing capacity and market power in the country. Next slide, please. My second concern is related to this as well, that as has been articulated, the INFF is really an approach that supports countries. No? In this case, the joint program is a catalytic program. No? It provides technical capacity to align finance with the SDGs, but we believe one of our concerns is especially it kind of understates the political character of development planning, especially how it would inherit the INFF, how it would inherit the long-running Philippine government approach on attracting private capital. We think that any approach in development planning could stress more in this framework that political character that we've mentioned and about which Paulie mentioned earlier. So while there is a level of CSO engagement, for instance, as I mentioned, in practice, this has involved, from the annual reports, a handful of CSOs, 4 or 5 CSOs have been mentioned. So we think that the broad level of CSO engagement is not at the forefront as we believe it should be. I end with last 2 points, or last 2 sets of points in the next slides, which are more of raised as questions. Moving forward, in the Philippine case, We ask whether the Philippine INFF, so far, despite the modest progress, has the process been broadly democratic? So I agree on Tom's point earlier on the need to broaden civil society engagement more. In the Philippine case, we have to broaden the constituencies, and this is yet to be seen in the evolving process given the relative limited space for CSO participation. Secondly, where are the organizations of the most marginalized, so-called, of the poor? Were they influential or were they even present? Where are the domestic trade unions, the organizations and social movements of the urban and the rural poor in this process? As affirmed earlier, this has to be asked. And important questions as well should be raised in the INFF structures. In the case of the Philippines, do these organizations, if and when they would be present in the future, would they have power in terms of steering the direction, the strategic direction of the INFF, or more of in the technical affairs around already preset objectives that are preset elsewhere? Lastly, I just need to highlight the INFF process in the Philippines departs from the already uneven terrain of big private sector actors vis-a-vis civil society in the Philippines. So while you have the chambers of commerce in the INFF structure, which is represented by the big business representatives, CSO engagement and the engagement of the most significant voices that should be there are not yet there. Last point, last slide, in terms of the broader question on systemic issues, I think it's important for us to ask if, in terms of how the INFF aligns with existing country policy priorities, does the process account for structural issues in development financing? In the Philippine case, are they asking questions about the tax regime, which is currently regressive, while on the other hand, very lenient on corporate taxes? Are they asking questions about debt, wherein now the Philippines is a top borrower of the World Bank? Are they asking questions about trade and how we could address the export orientation of the Philippine economy? And broadly, how we could address the historical reliance of the Philippines on remittances and FDI to finance its development without really improving the domestic industrial capacity? Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, is the INFF process reinforcing the risky approaches about private finance? And thirdly, and I think it is an important question to ask moving forward in the context of the polycrises or the multiple crises that we have now amid an already unequal recovery. So does the INFF, as practiced, offer a window for more ambitious policy shifts? Or is the danger that it could be a launchpad to legitimize business as usual norms originating from the international finance system? Is that risk present? And I believe the directions point to that possibility. So to end, I believe that indeed the INFF could help in some challenges. It's not a silver bullet, yes, but we should also be asking where is it aimed? What is the bullseye? What is the target? I think countries now in the international system should be looking at ambitious systemic reforms, and nationally we should be looking at prioritizing public finance, people's rights, and what Polly highlighted about alternative frameworks of social movements and people's organizations and civil society in terms of setting the direction of development planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo, for a very comprehensive and precise accounting, together with also measures and Marco's perspectives in this second segment. So I see no requests for the floor, but I would like to go back to Sherry and to Tom to see if they have any comments on what they have heard. And then maybe we'll try and wrap up the session, because I know that at 9 o'clock we have the official opening of the HLPF. Okay, I also see Amal has requested the floor. So Amal, maybe Sherry, Tom, if you don't mind, I'll give Amal the floor for a very quick intervention, and then over to you. Amal, over to you, please.
Good afternoon from London. I have really two comments how do you ensure an equal opportunity for CSO representation? Is there a criteria that is being set for the selection of those CSOs who will be participating in the process? This is one, and maybe I have missed it. What is the monitoring mechanism that is put in place in order to monitor the proper and reliable implementation of the process? And thirdly, I'm sorry, is the availability of data? Isn't the availability of reliable data in those countries an issue of concern for those who are engaged in the process?
Thanks, Amal. I also see Emilia Reyes from the Women's Working Group on FFD and also part of the FFD coordination group has asked the floor. Emilia, over to you before I move to Shari and Tom.
Thank you so much for this very rich conversation. Just wanted to ask very quickly in support of what Lori has been stating in the chat, in asking how are these framings are following up the recommendations by the IPCC report. We know that they mentioned degrowth and in a context of degrowth for the rich many times in the IPCC report, and it is very clear that we need to promote differentiated measures between developed countries and developing countries. And this is even more urgent now with the broader environmental emergencies, not only climate change. So I really wanted to ask, what is the science-based knowledge behind these recommendations that seem to go in the canonic trends rather than endorsing and keeping up to date to the environmental emergencies, and also mentioning that we don't see that there is a feminist view on this, like bearing in mind women's human rights, including an economic approach to it. So we are wondering the real impacts that these strategies are having, taking in mind current knowledge available in the economic traditions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. Pooja, over to you. And Emilia also pointed out that Lori has put a number of questions in the chat box, both in English and Spanish. So I would also invite to consider those. Pooja, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano. Yeah, I think a couple of questions. One, I think to Shari is in terms of INFFs helping streamline a lot of the existing planning frameworks. I was wondering if you could say more on what that looks like in practice, because I think there was a mapping exercise by FFP office that found there are 200 such planning frameworks between all the IATF members. So it would be useful to understand how adding one more helps. And then the other question is actually related a little bit to Emilia's point, which is, I mean, if INFFs is so inherently useful as a planning tool, why don't we see developed countries being asked to do INFFs? And I think I'm wondering if there's been any thinking around then also looking at kind of the spillover effects, of policies of developed countries that restricts the fiscal and policy space of developing countries. So it would be useful to see some of that kind of thinking from a developed country planning perspective. And so why don't we have that? So that's the other question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pooja. So let me go back to Shari and Tom. I'm not sure who wants to start first to hear their views. And then I would also welcome, just to wrap up, if any of the other panelists may want to have a sort of a 1 minute closing remark as well, I would be welcome to accommodate for that. Shari, maybe over to you first.
Great, thanks so much. So thanks for all of the comments and for the really excellent presentations of the country level work, which I thought were exactly what we hope to get out of these discussions. So in terms of, I'll just give a few comments and thoughts. First of all, just very quickly to Pooja, we don't see this as one more tool. It's not a tool. It's actually meant to, the reason we did that mapping exercise was part of the INFF process, to think through what is actually out there. There are too many tools, as we know, and they can conflict with each other. And so the first step was to try to bring them together and to sort of lay them out in one place. And so this is not an additional tool. This is, the aim is to bring it together. And really, this really goes to the to many of the comments made, that this is not a tool or a process. And maybe I'll get to that in a second, but it's a framework. All it's aiming to do is to strengthen the planning process to bring financing in. And how to do that, though, is really challenging, especially in a world where things are so integrated. Because in the past, the finance ministry would do this, but now you can't do it alone. And yet we know that to bring ministries together on the country level is one of the most challenging parts of any type of development planning. And so these are big challenges, and this is the framework to try to help to better bring these different pieces together to create a more integrated approach, but also to bring the support measures into one place to make things simpler. Now that's challenging too. And it's not going to happen like this, and it's not going to be the big solution, but at least we can take steps to do that. I just want to make three really quick comments. One is on the national and global level. I think we've all covered that, and we're all really in agreement that the big issues of debt and tax need to be addressed, but just because there is no agreement on that doesn't mean there shouldn't be work and thinking of what this all means on the national level, given for countries to in terms of their planning within the global context. But we can't, it's not one or the other. These really have to go together. And that's the entire point of the FFD process. And this year in the FFD forum, there was not even a session on INFFs. So it really was focused on the global, on many of the global issues. The second point I just want to get to quickly is this question of risks and trade-offs. And really, maybe the example is on economic growth, since a couple of people brought this up. So when you think about LDCs, for a second, let's focus on developed countries, because developing countries, because they're the ones who are to date using this, though it is meant to be a framework that's broader. And that's why we're doing deep dives to understand what this means for different types of countries. But certainly for developing countries, we are not setting, but for all countries, we are not setting the goals. We are not saying this is growth has to be the goal. We are linking to the SDGs, which have sustainable, equitable, inclusive growth as a goal. And so that is not, it's not an assumed objective from us. And certainly when we talk about an LDC, the question of planetary boundaries hopefully does not limit their ability to grow. Certainly they want to do it in a sustainable way, but everything we're doing in each of, this is a broad framework, and in each of the areas, of course, everyone is thinking about the science and the analysis that goes underneath it. That, I mean, in a sense, that's the entire breadth and thinking of the work that we are all doing. So just to say that there's no, if we were to think about developed countries, then what does sustainable growth mean there are different questions. And we would love for developed countries to do an INFF and to think about showcase what that means and showcase what these trade-offs means. And we've actually talked to a couple of countries that have really excellent planning processes, and in a sense, don't call it an INFF, but that's what they may be doing. And so to think about maybe showcasing some of this, we've actually had conversations with a few countries about showcasing that. And it's something that maybe should be thought of more. Of course, no country is doing this perfectly, as we know. That's why we are in the challenges we're in. But to try to think about what this means more broadly is definitely an issue. But I don't think we are linking to the SDGs. We are linking to government priorities, which actually brings a really interesting question about the governance issues. So as our colleague from Kenya said, the PRSPs, oh, and I'm talking for too long because you only have 2 minutes left. So I'll say this really quickly. We're all thinking about that experiment. From the very first day, we were thinking about this. You know, what were the mistakes made? How does one think about a new way of capacity development that is really country-led, where the foreign, the external actors bring their knowledge, but let the decision-making and the local expertise comes from the national side. And so there's a lot of tools about thinking, a lot of work thinking about how do we avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past. But I think the example that Kenya gave, that Maya gave, that was really interesting, or maybe it came from the Philippine discussion, was that governments are the governments, and this is country-led, it's led by the government. So we're not going to, you know, there's this tension almost between saying we want civil society to come, we want it to be government-led, and the governments may not really want and invite civil society into their policymaking processes. And in a sense, we're saying, well, the external actors should push them to do so. And so it's just an interesting challenge. I think that the Philippine example really laid out some of the big challenges of what this means on the national level, and how important it is to hear your voices, for you to be involved in these processes, and to continue to challenge to make this tool as useful as possible. And I think I wanted to make some more comments, but I think I've talked too long. So
No.
back over to you.
Thanks, Shari. I guess that's a good example on how this conversation has to continue. We are a bit struggling with time. Tom, is there any very, very quick point that you would like to add to what Shari has mentioned? Otherwise, I think I'll have to wrap up the session.
Yeah, no, Stefano, look, really just to say thank you and to emphasize that the insights that the colleagues from civil society have given us on the processes as they're engaged with them and as they're looking at them are hugely valuable. You know, the success of the endeavor towards integrated national financing frameworks rests also upon civil society engagement. And you know, I think we need to look to more regularized discussion between ourselves so that we can really work as effectively as possible to bring in civil society to each and every integrated national financing framework. So thank you so much, Stefano.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you so much, everyone. We are, I know that there are also some comments in the chat that Dakun Basia just placed, to also consider how this applies to situations that may be, you know, ripe with conflict, or situations which are somehow complicated by a number of other factors that sometimes we do not consider properly within the development process. Well, colleagues, what to say? That's been a very interesting discussion. I think there's no point of me trying to wrap it up other than saying that there are clear tensions between the theory and what actually happens in practice, in terms of how, you know, good ideas sometimes can also be trapped by status quo situations or by political economies and other dynamics. And that's the reason why it's always important to continue this discussion, continue the review of what happens in reality, and feedback it back in terms of the original theory and the original impulse on this kind of activities. This is certainly what we are continue to be committed to do as civil society platforms that engage on financing for development. And therefore, you know, we really look forward to continuing this debate. We'll continue to publish our reviews and our briefs, including the review of the of country cases, which we probably think will help understanding where are the gaps between theory and practice. But other than this, the financing for development agenda, as Shari said at the very beginning, is much broader. And we really need to ensure that we put emphasis on addressing long-lasting systemic policy reforms and institutional reforms. And this is the reason why I want to close this session, but also inviting you to another side event tomorrow, also hosted by the Civil Society Financing for Development Group, on the prospects and opportunities and process for a Financing for Development Conference 4, which, as you know, is going to be the big decisions ahead of the General Assembly in the fall. So we look forward for your participation, as that will complement and integrate our discussion here on integrated national financing frameworks with the bigger agenda for systemic reforms. So many thanks to all the co-organizers, to all the participants, to all the panelists, but also to the group of CSO organizations that have been working towards you know, a comprehensive review of how these integrated national financing frameworks offer opportunities, but also risks. Many thanks to everyone, and enjoy HLPF. Thanks everyone, and thanks also to our supporting team and our interpreters. Thank you so much. Bye everyone.
Thank you, and thanks Stefano for doing a great job moderating.
Thank you for great.
Thank you to you all.
Bye.
you.